I gave them one answer. Africa is not for sale. And Netanyahu? He's shocked. His embassy sent urgent messages. His ministers demanded explanations. His companies called in old favors they had been saving for years. They told me canceling deals with Israel was political suicide. Lobbyists warned me. Businessmen threatened me. Even my own advisors whispered that I was risking my life. But just 3 minutes ago, I signed the decree. Every Israeli deal in Burkina Faso is blocked. Not delayed. Not renegotiated. Blocked. And Netanyahu? He's shocked. His embassy sent urgent messages. His ministers demanded explanations. His companies called in old favors they had been saving for years. I gave them one answer. Africa is not for sale. Why does this moment matter? Because for decades, Israeli corporations weren't just signing contracts here. They were weaving themselves into the very veins of our continent. Mining concessions disguised as partnerships. Telecom networks that doubled as surveillance grids. Agricultural projects that took farmers' land while pretending to develop it. They thought we were blind. They thought we were too desperate to notice. But we saw everything. Last month, my intelligence service handed me a dossier thicker than a Bible. Inside were blueprints of Israeli-backed infrastructure projects, roads leading straight into mineral-rich zones, satellite dishes wired to foreign intelligence hubs, contracts signed by leaders who never told their people the real cost. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my office staring at those papers until the desert wind rattled my windows and the first call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou. I asked myself the question every African leader must face. Who do you serve? Your people or the powers who fund you? Because in those pages, I saw maps marked with red circles, gold mines, lithium fields, uranium deposits. But the roads didn't lead to African markets. They led to Tel Aviv, Paris, Washington. I saw telecom towers branded with corporate logos, standing tall across our land. But behind that branding were systems feeding our people's voices into foreign servers. Every call, every text, every private word of an African family, packaged and sold like a commodity on markets we would never see. I saw irrigation projects in satellite images. Fields that should have fed our children, but instead fenced off, guarded by men with foreign accents, harvested for export. The farmers who once worked that land became laborers on their own soil, earning wages too small to buy bread. And the most chilling part, these weren't isolated deals. Not one, not 10, not 50. It was a network, a spiderweb stretching across 17 African nations. Every thread leading back to the same hands. They thought Africa would never piece it together. They underestimated us. They always do. But I did piece it together. And once I saw the full picture, I knew there was no going back to the comfortable lies of partnership and development. The more I studied those documents, the clearer the pattern became. Every Israeli project followed the same script. Enter through humanitarian channels, build infrastructure disguised as aid, then slowly turn it into a tool for intelligence gathering. In Ghana, they built towers for rural connectivity. Within 2 years, every phone call was routed through servers in Tel Aviv. In Kenya, they installed agricultural monitoring systems to help farmers. But in reality, they were tracking population movements and mapping resources with military precision. In Mali, they set up tech training centers for young Africans. The real goal: to recruit intelligence assets while mining data from every device that passed through. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. This wasn't random corporate greed. This was organized intelligence colonization, directed from the highest levels of the Israeli government. What shocked me most was the Western cooperation. French companies provided legal cover. British firms built financial structures. American corporations gave technological support. Together, they were carving up Africa's digital sovereignty like colonial powers once carved maps. And the pressure came fast, from every direction. First, the lobbyists. Men in expensive suits, fake smiles, rehearsed threats. They promised consequences if I disrupted their partnerships. Economic isolation, diplomatic problems, and accidents that often happen to leaders who refuse to play along. Then came the businessmen offering contracts worth billions, shares in multinationals, Swiss bank accounts that would keep my family rich for generations. When I refused, their charm turned into menace. One leaned across my desk and said coldly, "Mr. President, you're playing a game you don't understand. The rules were written long before you were born." When even that failed, the threats grew louder. Rumors of coups spread in diplomatic circles. Assassination plots appeared in intelligence briefings from friendly nations. Even some of my own advisors, men I trusted with my life, pulled me aside in fear. "Mr. President, slow down. Don't provoke them. You know what happens to African leaders who resist. Gaddafi is gone. Sankara is gone. No one fights Israel and survives. But they forgot something. Something their money, their steel, their threats could never touch. I wasn't raised in palaces. I wasn't educated in foreign universities. I didn't grow up at banquets where Africa's wealth was treated like stock shares. I grew up watching my mother count coins for bread, her hands trembling as she tried to stretch our meager income. I grew up watching my father's hands crack and bleed in the gold mines, while foreign trucks carried away riches he would never touch. So when they told me this fight was impossible, I asked, impossible for who? For the men who profit from our silence, or for the people who already have nothing left to lose? 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief, Colonel Sawadogo, walked into my office carrying a folder that would change everything. His face was gray. His usual military composure was shaken. Inside that folder were communication intercepts, financial records, and satellite images showing the full scope of what we were facing. "Mr. President," he said, placing the documents before me, "what we've uncovered goes far beyond anything we imagine. Israeli-backed companies weren't just doing business in Burkina Faso. They were mapping our mineral deposits with military precision, recording our political meetings through compromised telecommunications, and tracking our citizens through facial recognition systems we never agreed to install. But what truly convinced me that diplomacy was no longer an option was this. They were sharing that intelligence with multinational corporations, helping them squeeze better deals out of African governments. Our own data was being weaponized against us, used to exploit us more efficiently. That entire night, I sat in my office with the dossier spread across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. The papers looked ordinary, typed contracts, maps, spreadsheets. But to me, they felt like chains. Chains wrapped around my people's necks, disguised as development and partnership. Outside my window, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware their every digital footprint was being harvested and sold. Children dreamed in beds their parents could barely afford, while foreign servers stored their biometric data for future exploitation. At 5 a.m., as the first hints of dawn painted the sky, I made my decision. I picked up the secure phone and called my generals. "Wake them up," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of what was coming. "Today, we cut the web." General Cabra asked for operational details. I gave him only 2 words that would define the next phase of our history: no mercy. 2 hours later, while most of Ouagadougou still slept, our forces struck with the precision of a surgeon's blade. 17 targets, identified after months of surveillance, were hit at the same time. No warnings. No negotiations. No chance for evidence to vanish. By 7 a.m., the spiderweb that had taken decades to weave was being torn apart. The first sight was a gleaming telecommunications building on the eastern edge of town. From the street, it looked like any other office: corporate logos, tinted glass, employees arriving for another normal workday. But inside, my soldiers uncovered something that would make international headlines, though most media outlets would never tell the full story. Rows of server rooms filled with machines powerful enough to monitor communications across half the continent. Hard drives containing personal data of over 2 million Burkina-based citizens, their locations, relationships, private conversations, all cataloged and ready to be shipped off to foreign intelligence services. At the second site, the discovery was even darker. In a warehouse district, what appeared to be a humanitarian storage center, with signs promising emergency relief supplies and agricultural aid, was anything but. Instead of medicine and food, the warehouses were packed with surveillance drones. Hundreds of them, programmed to track movement across rural areas. These weren't photography drones for civilians. They were military-grade surveillance tools designed to spy on farmers and villagers who had no idea they were living under constant observation. We even found the operation manual, written in Hebrew, with targeting coordinates that matched our major farming regions and mineral sites. By 9 a.m., 6 more facilities had fallen. Each one revealed the same sinister truth. Legitimate businesses hiding sophisticated espionage networks. Development projects that developed nothing but foreign intelligence capabilities. Aid organizations that aided only their master's surveillance operations. The evidence was overwhelming. And for the first time in years, Africa had undeniable proof of what many of us had long suspected. But I knew proof alone wasn't enough. Documents could be buried, excuses manufactured, and global media could spin our discoveries as misunderstandings or overreactions. The world needed to see action, not just accusations. At noon, I entered the press conference room, where cameras from across the continent waited. The lights were blinding, the microphones hissed with anticipation, but I didn't hesitate. I looked straight into the main camera lens and spoke words that would echo across Africa and beyond. Africa is no longer your laboratory. We are no longer your test subjects. And we are no longer your blind spot. But I wasn't finished. The moment demanded more than sound bites. It demanded truth spoken with conviction. For too long, we've accepted the language of partnership while living the reality of exploitation. We've signed contracts written in boardrooms where African voices were never heard. We've welcomed development projects that develop everything except African prosperity. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Then I continued. Today, that ends. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso ends now. Every surveillance network built on lies is shut down immediately. Every contract signed in bad faith is null and void. Those words weren't just for my people, though the streets outside erupted in cheers. They were a direct message to Tel Aviv, to Paris, to Washington, and every capital where African sovereignty was treated as optional. And within hours, the world felt the shockwave. By evening, phone lines between African capitals were burning with activity. Foreign embassies demanded clarification, hiding their panic. Western media called my actions radical and destabilizing. Israeli envoys requested urgent private meetings, hoping to patch things up behind closed doors. But I had no intention of hiding in smoky back rooms where Africa's dignity had been sold off for generations. So I repeated my decree, this time in plain, unshakable words. Every Israeli intelligence operation in Burkina Faso is terminated. Every surveillance contract is canceled, effective immediately. That sentence was a thunderclap across the continent. Within 24 hours, the ripple effects were visible everywhere. In Bamako, Mali, students painted my words on walls, adding their own messages of defiance. In Conakry, Guinea, fishing cooperatives announced they would no longer sell to companies with Israeli ties. In Dar es Salaam, women's groups declared they would review every foreign partnership for hidden surveillance components. It wasn't organized. It wasn't directed by any central authority. It was pure instinct. A continent that had been silent for too long had finally heard the echo of its own voice, and it refused to let it fade. That very evening, calls from other African leaders began pouring in. Mali's president, Ibrahim Bobareta, reached me on the secure line. "Ibrahim," he said, his voice heavy with both relief and determination. "We found similar operations in Bamako, Israeli companies with communication equipment sending reports back to foreign servers. What should we do? Shut them down?" I told him without hesitation. "All of them." Guinea's military leadership contacted us through encrypted channels, admitting they had been monitoring suspicious Israeli activity for months but hadn't known how to act without risking a diplomatic crisis. "General," I told their operations commander, "stop worrying about diplomatic incidents. Start worrying about digital colonialism." By the end of that week, 4 West African nations had frozen Israeli military technology imports. 6 more had launched emergency audits of foreign-backed infrastructure projects. Behind closed doors, the African Union began discussing something never attempted before: a continental strategy to counter foreign intelligence infiltration. But what truly terrified Netanyahu's government was this: it was no longer just about Israel. The evidence we uncovered revealed something far more disturbing: systematic cooperation between Israeli operations and the intelligence services of France, Britain, and the United States. Our telecommunications infrastructure wasn't compromised by a single foreign power. It had been infiltrated by an entire network of allied intelligence services, sharing African data the way colonial powers once carved up African land on 19th century maps. For decades, they had treated Africa like a free intelligence zone, trading information about our governments, movements, and resources as if our sovereignty simply didn't exist. That realization changed everything for me. I understood we weren't only fighting Israeli overreach. We were confronting a colonial mindset that never truly ended. It had simply learned to use fiber optic cables instead of gunboats. The scale of betrayal was staggering. French companies provided the legal frameworks to make surveillance look legitimate. British firms built the financial structures to hide intelligence funding. American corporations offered civilian-seeming platforms that carried military-grade monitoring capabilities. They had turned Africa's digital development into a Trojan horse for permanent surveillance. Then, in real time, I began witnessing the awakening of a continent. Grainy cell phone videos showed farmers in Niger chanting my name while burning fake development contracts. Crowds in Ghana filled public squares, holding signs that read, "Africa is not for sale," and "Our data, our choice." In Johannesburg, thousands marched through the financial district, their voices bouncing off the steel and glass towers of multinational banks. And then something happened I never expected. Inside the usually ceremonial chambers of the African Union, where leaders normally shuffled papers and read from prepared scripts, one by one they began to stand. Each repeated the same demand: "We must review our deals, all of them." It was like watching a dam burst after decades of pressure. For generations, African presidents and ministers had bowed their heads whenever Western powers entered the room, accepting whatever terms were offered because resistance seemed impossible. Now, they were standing, not just for Burkina Faso, not just for me, but for themselves and their people. The morning after our operations concluded, I received an angry call from an Israeli diplomat demanding to know under what authority I had acted against legitimate business operations. I told him exactly what authority I had. The authority of a sovereign nation that refuses to be spied on by foreign powers, disguising espionage as development. But the real conversation happened 2 days later. Netanyahu himself requested a private phone call through diplomatic channels. The Israeli Prime Minister, the man who had built his career on projecting strength, was now calling an African military leader to explain himself. President Traore, he began, his voice carefully controlled. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding about our activities in your region, Mr. Netanyahu, I replied, steel in my tone. The only misunderstanding was your assumption that we wouldn't notice systematic surveillance disguised as development aid. He tried the familiar script. Israeli companies were contributing to African progress, creating jobs, building infrastructure that benefited our people. I cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Netanyahu, when you build infrastructure that spies on the people it's supposed to serve, that's not development. That's occupation with better marketing. The silence that followed was heavy. For several seconds, the line carried only the weight of truth spoken directly to power. These operations provide valuable intelligence that protects regional stability, he finally said, dropping the pretense of pure development. Whose stability? I asked. The stability of governments willing to sell their people's privacy for foreign investment, or the stability of citizens who deserve to know when their communications are being monitored. The call lasted 12 minutes. Netanyahu never called back, but his government's response was swift. Israeli media reported that I was destabilizing the region and threatening democratic partnerships. European newspapers published editorials questioning my authoritarian tendencies and warning of the dangers of radical leadership in West Africa. The same newspapers, I should note, that had never once asked why foreign intelligence operations were legal in African nations to begin with. While Tel Aviv scrambled for damage control, something extraordinary was happening in Africa's streets. Leaked transcripts from Israeli cabinet meetings revealed Netanyahu pounding the table, demanding answers from his African operations team. How did this boy dismantle decades of strategic positioning in one morning? But it wasn't just me. It was the people. The miners who refused to load gold onto trucks bound for foreign ports. The students who rejected textbooks teaching African inferiority. The mothers who refused to let their children inherit digital chains. The evening our operations concluded, thousands of people gathered outside the presidential compound. They didn't come to protest my actions, they came to celebrate them. Young people held signs saying, "Our data, our choice. African information for African development." University students organized teach-ins about digital sovereignty, showing their communities how surveillance was being disguised as modernization. Even my critics admitted that what we had revealed needed to be exposed. Opposition leaders, who usually attacked my every decision, stood in front of cameras and said, "Whatever our disagreements with President Traore, we support African digital independence." That unity scared our adversaries more than any military action ever could. For the first time, they saw that African resistance was no longer dependent on a single leader or government. It was becoming a continental consciousness. The strongest validation came from a surprising source: other African leaders. For years, many had been quietly frustrated with foreign interference. Now they began reaching out. Presidents, prime ministers, and military commanders from across Africa started sharing intelligence on suspicious foreign activities. Together, we uncovered a much bigger picture: systematic surveillance and data extraction that no single nation could fight alone. That's when I realized we needed something entirely new: an African intelligence doctrine, created by Africans for African interests. In the weeks that followed, I worked with leaders from 6 West African nations to draft what we call the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. It wasn't just policy, it was a declaration of digital independence. The principles were clear and revolutionary. Full transparency for all foreign investments in telecom and data infrastructure. Any company wanting to operate in Africa must submit to audits by African-controlled oversight bodies. No exceptions, not even for national security or proprietary technology. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence operations. If a foreign project couldn't prove it served African interests, it would be shut down immediately. No grace periods. No diplomatic loopholes. Cooperation across the continent to monitor and respond to foreign interference. What affects one African nation affects us all. Mandatory data localization. African data must stay on African servers unless a government explicitly authorizes otherwise for transparent, limited purposes. And the principle that unsettled Western governments the most. African digital infrastructure will exist primarily to serve Africa. Foreign access is a privilege, not a right. Israel's government dismissed our framework as unrealistic and economically damaging. Ministers warned that Africa couldn't survive without Israeli expertise. They predicted collapse, isolation, and irrelevance. They were wrong. Within 3 weeks of implementing our new digital sovereignty protocols, we had partnership offers from China, Russia, India, Brazil, and even some European companies willing to operate under transparent rules. Turns out the world has plenty of tech partners who don't need to spy on their customers to do business. Chinese companies, despite their reputation for digital authoritarianism, agreed to our transparency requirements. Russian partners accepted full audits without resistance. Brazilian firms offered communication solutions that kept all data within African borders. Even European companies began advertising themselves as digital sovereignty compliant to stand apart from competitors who refused our terms. The market was rewarding transparency and punishing surveillance capitalism, just as we hoped. The impact spread faster than I imagined. Morocco introduced laws requiring explicit citizen consent for foreign data collection. Kenya launched audits of its international telecom deals and uncovered hidden monitoring systems. Nigeria forced foreign tech firms to store all citizen data on Nigerian soil, under Nigerian jurisdiction. Even South Africa, usually cautious with Western allies, declared that digital infrastructure must serve African interests first. And then came the most unexpected validation. In private, even American intelligence officials admitted to African diplomats that they were rethinking some of their data practices. Not out of goodwill, but because our framework was inspiring similar moves across the global South. Once one continent demanded sovereignty, it became harder to deny it elsewhere. Soon, governments in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands were studying our framework. Countries that had never considered digital sovereignty before were suddenly demanding the same protections. The domino effect was exactly what global intelligence networks had feared most. But perhaps the most powerful change isn't in government policy, it's in the minds of young Africans. Across the continent, university students are studying the framework in their political science courses. They're organizing conferences about technological independence. They're demanding that their governments reject foreign partnerships that compromise digital autonomy. A new generation is growing up with a simple expectation. Their data, their communications, and their infrastructure should serve Africa first. To them, digital sovereignty isn't radical or anti-Western. It's just common sense, just as natural as expecting physical borders to be respected. They cannot understand why older generations tolerated surveillance as the price of development. 6 months after Operation Clear Sight, I can say this with pride. Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure is more secure, more transparent, and more beneficial to our people than at any time in our history. Our internet speeds have actually improved since we terminated compromised partnerships and replaced them with transparent alternatives. Telecommunications costs have decreased as we eliminated the hidden expenses of surveillance systems. Today, every byte of our citizens' data is stored on African soil, under African law. For the first time, our people know their government protects their digital rights instead of trading them away for foreign dollars.